The volume levels here, make sure that we don't have that static standby. I know this is just awesome watching me do this. Hang on here. Oh gosh, it's all wadded up. Check 1 2, test, 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 test. Check 1 2, test, test. Okay, there we go. We have good volume. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up where we left off. Aloha. How are you? I know. I'm ready just to kind of, you just sort of just pack a lunch and just hang out on the rocks somewhere there, you know, beside this. Okay, anyway, there we go. Yes, and aloha to paradise. And now we're going to jump right back into the fray. Looking here at multi-engine, some of the gauges and things that we talked about here before had to do with how these gauges are going to look. So what you see here is you'll see a left and a right for the engines. Normally in the single engine plane, you'll just have like a one vertical column here for these digital displays that you'll see. Cylinder head temperatures, again, in the Lycomings, the smaller horsepower Lycomings, we like to keep those cylinder head temperatures below 400. They can go above 400 for just a little bit, but somewhere in that 380 to 400 range is kind of where we like to keep them. Here's an exhaust gas temperature. This is going to be a thing that you're going to see here again, where we're looking at the, you know, the various cylinders here, as well as the temperature differential here between the left and the right. Analog displays here, again, what you'll see for multi-engine aircraft, you'll have a left engine, right engine, and you'll look at those. Here you'll have your oil levels, you'll have your pressures, this could be temperatures, I'm sorry, not oil levels, temperatures. The oil temperatures here, and this is also kind of something that you see in some of these older displays. You'll notice that the difference here in the way they have this display set up versus this one, my guess is that at some point they have replaced these, and you can see that you've got a RAM over here on this side and probably not over here on this side. But the you do wind up over time with sort of a mix and match type of gauge look to some of these older birds. You know, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just that as they replace them or whatever, or they service them, or they overhaul the particular gauge, that's kind of the way it looks. You'll notice a little bit of a difference here also in the how these lines and these arrows are set up. And that's another thing about multis, especially older multis, is that it takes a while to kind of understand what gauge is telling you what are the differences between the two, especially if they've been displayed. Sometimes if owners decide to keep the airplanes, they'll just do a complete avionics overhaul and they'll put glass in there as opposed to the analog gauges. But they've got to decide that they're going to keep those planes for a while because that's kind of a pricey upgrade. So you can see there again what the cylinder head temperatures look like here, and then you have your EGTs. This is going to be a single display, and what you'll have is that you'll have a left and a right here also. In some cases they'll have these little bugs where they'll say, okay, this is normal, this is kind of our target where we want to shoot for. Some cases they won't, but as you look at these, you'll see that you have kind of two of everything. And this goes back to what we talked about before, the two of everything piece. A lot of times you would think 1 + 1 = 2 when you think about cost and complexity, but in some cases 1 + 1 may equal 3. Is that there is not this direct correlation between the This is going to be a thing. I've got these guys working on the house here today, and if they need to ask me a question, I may need to go back down there. Golly. They're doing some banging. I don't think they're knocking on the door or the dogs would be going nuts. So I'm hopeful that that's just kind of what's happening. Anyway, okay, on with the show. When we look here, engine, the lubrication, you understand oils. We've talked about the types of oils. We've talked about, the differences in here. Again, reading them, maintenance. This is going to be a thing. And normally the engine oils now, normally they last quite a long time. The weak link in the entire lubrication and filtration system is the actual filter itself. Over time, the media inside those filters, it just dissolves and it just becomes this wad. And so it's not necessarily a case that we're changing the oil because the oil needs to be changed. We're changing the oil because the filter needs to be changed. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind there also with some of the newer systems. Some of the older birds, absolutely, because now the tolerances are different. You'll notice pretty early on a change in the color of the oil. It goes from that nice kind of that honey brown color that most of the newer engines stay. And some of the older engines, as they start making metal, they start looking black. And so those are things that you kind of need to look for. It's not necessarily that black oil is bad oil, but it's just kind of the way that it goes. Grades and viscosities, we've covered that. Oil storage delivery, we've covered that. Oil coolers. These are going to be things here that I talked about briefly last time. Is some of these engines will have an oil cooler that they'll run that through. They use these coolers not just to cool the oil and help keep the engines cooler, but also what they'll do is that on some of these oil coolers, they will put a manifold over that oil cooler, and they'll actually use that for heat. At certain places, I know that in the Velocity, the way that they have that set up is because you have a rear engine aircraft and it's hard to kind of duct the actual exhaust manifold heat into the cockpit for that. So what they do is they run these lines up to the nose of the airplane, and they have an oil cooler that they have set up in the nose of the airplane. They'll pull that heat off that oil cooler, and that's what they use for cabin air. It takes longer for that cabin air piece to kind of spool up, but once it does, it will heat the cockpit. The other thing that it does is that in most cases it'll take some of that carbon monoxide issue that can get pumped into the cabin. It kind of takes that away, because now clearly we're not getting any kind of carbon monoxide thing from that oil going through the oil cooler. So pros, cons there with that. There, the ignitions, we talk about those. We talk about magnetos in providing that that controlled, timed spark to the cylinders there into the spark plugs that we have. Most of those magnetos, as we look at those, about every 500 hours, those things need to be replaced, and they'll do like a swap out with those, a serviced magneto as opposed to a brand new one. But that's kind of how it works. Most multi-engine aircraft, they do not have a key for the ignition switch. They will have magnetos and starter switches, so you won't necessarily have that, clear prop, turn the key, and then adjust your mixture to start. What they'll have is that they'll have kind of someplace over here, they'll have a magneto switch that you have. And so keeping the cockpits locked basically keeps somebody from taking your airplane, because in a lot of them they don't have keys. So the key is just to the door itself. As you flip the switches, in some cases you'll have primers that will actually shoot some of the fuel into those cylinders there as well. And so you have this thing where you kind of tickle the primer, to kind of get the engine started as you hold the magnetos on. So that's kind of a way to start those airplanes. They're all a little bit different. Again, remember that in the engine controls that you've got this thing called the throttle quadrant with this. And it's kind of a varying setup. Remember the colors and the shapes of the handles themselves. So in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at the throttle is going to be over here on the left. Your prop is going to be here in the center, and your mixture over here on this side, and it'll have black, blue, and red. Some of the older airplanes, and it was really kind of weird because some of the older ones, you would have the prop controls in the very center. You may have, not the prop controls. You may have the throttle controls in the center. You may have the prop over here and the mixture over here. I've seen those in some of these older airplanes like that. It's a little confusing, especially when we start dealing with kind of engine out and power issues that we're having, and kind of which way you work your flow as far as adding power and decreasing power. So, and we'll talk about that here again, but just know that in some of these older airplanes, the configuration can be a little bit different. So you always want to verify which handle does what. So there's a picture of that. Some of the differences between some of the analog versus the digital displays that you'll have. In some cases, you're going to have a dual needle display. So for instance, you may have in a manifold pressure with a multi-engine aircraft, you'll have manifold pressure and you'll have RPM. Well, you'll have two different needles. One will be for the left engine, one will be for the right engine. You got to make sure you know which is which on these things. The rest of this, is kind of normal. Temperatures, pressures, fuel quantities, and with this, here again, you have your oil pressures here for left and right, oil temperatures here left and right, cylinder head temperatures left and right, and for me, I just prefer the digital, but it's not that you can't use the analog. So here we go. Best practices for multi-engine operations. This is something definitely I want you to read because there is some good information here about this that kind of goes a little bit beyond the normal single engine operations. Certainly good information for single engine, but there are a couple of things in here that they do talk about here for multi-engine work. Multi-engine work, again, you're going to want to, for everything that you do with the single, you have to do it twice for the multi. On these here, understanding that on the takeoff piece with this, it can be a little bit different when everything is working properly, and it'll be a whole lot different when things are not. So this is, things that are going to be just a little bit different here when you read this. Looking here. The big thing here, shock cooling. That is really the big concern, especially with big, heavy, expensive engines hanging out there. And again, it is understanding that our goal is to begin cooling these engines about 1 degree of manifold pressure per minute here with this. And that's kind of how we want to cool these. The engine emergencies, this is going to be a thing that sets the multis apart from the singles. With an engine emergency in a single, your hands are not quite as full, and in some cases it gets very simple. If that engine goes out, you're landing. And then with the multi, if you have an engine go out, well, it's like, okay, which engine has gone out? That's going to kind of define your workload on these multi-engine birds here also. And that's kind of it there on the power plant there in Chapter 2. So now we're going to get into the propeller system. The propeller system's here, similar to a single with one huge exception. With most single engine airplanes, especially with controllable pitch propellers, you can, with your propeller adjustment, you can then adjust the angle of that blade as it strikes the molecules as it's going through. You can't adjust the twist. The twist of the blade is pre-molded or pre-formed on the blade. But in that hub there on your propeller, which is controlled by oil pressure in there as it turns, as it allows that blade angle to turn, then you can turn that to a degree. But what happens is that in the event of an engine out, you want to try to get things as slippery as possible. Well, what would be great is that if you could turn that blade angle into the wind to minimize any kind of drag. In a single engine, you can't fully do that. You can help it a little bit, but you can't completely feather that blade into the wind to kind of keep that from really slowing you down and causing that adverse, drag. It's like air brakes almost. With a multi-engine aircraft, all of them that I'm aware of have full feathering propellers. And what that means is that you can take your propeller handle and you can pull it down to a stop that goes beyond a detent in the throttle quadrant all the way down to what we call full feather. And what that does, that turns that blade almost all the way kind of parallel to your wind to really reduce the drag on that propeller. Why do they do it on there? We'll talk about that when we talk about aerodynamics, but it's a huge thing to feather that engine. It can also be a huge thing to get that airplane, if you're able to get that engine started again, to get it out of feather. And so that's another thing that kind of separates singles from multis, and we'll take a look at that here. This is definitely something you're going to want to read here again. And you'll look at this here. The big consequence that you have is that if you have a multi-engine aircraft and you are unable to get those blades into the feathered position, having those blades at kind of that flatter presentation into the wind like you would when you're flying the airplane, whatever the diameter of your blades happen to be, it's almost like having a sheet of plywood that big into that wind. It has that big of an effect on the asymmetric loading that you're going to have on that airplane, and trying to keep that nose pointed in the direction of flight is going to be almost impossible if you can't get that airplane, those blades, to feather into that wind. You pay that huge of an aerodynamic penalty for that. So we talk about the multi-engine, these things, the controllable pitch function. These are things that you know. This is no different from the constant speed propellers that we have in the Diamond. Here as well, this kind of shows you what that looks like and how that loads. It also, again, that oil going through that hub, that oil pressure, that's kind of what does that there, and that's that governor pump that allows all of that to happen. All of this stuff is stuff that you know before. High pitch, low pitch RPM. Again, this is stuff that we have talked about here before in how all of this works. Here we go. High pitch, low pitch, all of this stuff works. Looking here, just making sure that nothing is any different here than what we have talked about before. Here with all of this, this is kind of a nice illustration about what this looks like. One of the things that you have is that a little bit different here is this thing called an unfeathering accumulator. Now what that does is that you have, in a lot of cases, you'll have a gas. They'll probably use nitrogen. That is kind of what they'll use for that. And you'll have that nitrogen that is in sort of a standby position. And let's say that you put your airplane into feather and you have to feather that prop. Well, you feather that prop and you turn that into the wind. Okay, great. Now, let's say you want to restart that engine. Well, one of the things that you may have happen is you may say, okay, how do I start turning this? And if I start turning that engine with these blades in that particular configuration, I am so sorry, I thought that was off, is that if you start turning that propeller in that configuration, it's going to put a pretty good toll on that engine while that's trying to swing these great big paddles around the horn like that in this configuration. So you want to be able to have something move those propellers quickly as that engine starts to turn that propeller. these accumulators, what they do is that they'll accumulate a certain amount of this gas that as you pull it out of feather will automatically engage, and it'll almost blast those propellers into a pitched position to help you start turning that engine and allow that airplane to come out of feather and into a normal rotation type of a configuration. Some of them will do it automatically. Some of them you have to have another little button that you push to actually launch that. Some of them don't necessarily have that accumulator that will work on these things. So again, you have to know what system your aircraft has in order to make that happen. In some cases, you have to try to unfeather that, allow that propeller to windmill before you hit that mag switch to go ahead and try to restart that engine. Let's say that you haven't been managing the fuel flow between tanks or whatever, and you ran this engine out of gas. Well, you want to get gas flowing over here into this side, cross-feeding the fuel into this engine, and then so you've got the fuel going to it. You can kind of start your unfeather process. It'll start windmilling, then you hit your mags, turn it all on, and it should go. In some cases, you may not have to push the priming or anything else if you're doing this, but you have to start that engine by pushing those mags. Every engine, they have their own different kind of idiosyncrasies as to how they do it, but that's kind of how it works. So read here on this accumulator to kind of see how that works. Here's one here with this nitrogen gas system piece here. Here we go, talking about unfeathering here, anti-feather pins. One of the things too is that they have and this kind of goes down to something similar to what happens in other airplanes here as well. But what they do is that when you shut that engine down, you don't want it to go into feather with that, and so they have these pins that will kind of hold that so that when you shut the airplane down, it won't go into feather, and that's kind of what they call an anti-feather pin to keep that going. Prop synchronizers and synchrophasers. When you have two engines turning, and you may have them set close to the same RPM, the same pitch settings, etc. And when you're flying, you'll hear this wah, 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 wah kind of a sound. And what that's doing is it's telling you there just audibly that now what you have is that you have two different rotational speeds kind of going on there. And in some cases, you'll hear an airplane flying by, especially as it's getting closer to an airport, and they are starting to reduce power. A couple of things going on. One is that each different, over time, each different propeller throttle, or excuse me, each different throttle, throttle prop mixture, they'll all wind up with different types of tension that they have on the cabling that they use here on the back sides of these things. So you can have the throttle levers lined up where they look perfect to you, but they may not exactly be the same thing in sync as they were perhaps when they rolled off the assembly line at Vero Beach, Florida, those many years ago, if you're flying a Piper. And so what happens is that you as the pilot, you will learn kind of what that difference is. And in some cases, you kind of learn, okay, my right engine the cable may be a little tighter than the left. Left is a little bit looser, and so you may have to have this left prop, the left throttle, the left throttle knob a little bit lower on the quadrant than the right one for them to be balanced. But you kind of learn where that is, and so you're going to make that adjustment here, not just with your prop setting here, but also with your power settings to kind of synchronize those so that you don't hear that wah 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 sound, because over time that'll just make you crazy. Not just that, but you have two different engines pulling differently here into the air, and so you want those to be the same, because that also can reduce your workload on your rudder also there, as holding that longitudinal axis as you're flying straight, hopefully. So you want to get those things in sync. Well, you can do it manually in some aircraft, but some aircraft also have a switch. where you can also do a synchronizer, and they will do that for you electronically and synchronize those propellers. Nice thing to have if you have it and if it works. But if it doesn't, know that you can do it, the old school way there as well. Equalizing the load on both sides and getting rid of that wah, 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 wah. So you'll do that wah, here, more sound effects, okay? The wah, 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 as you're making that adjustment, what you'll hear is wah, 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 wah. Thank you. Thank you very much. There you go. That's kind of how you're going to be using that when you make those adjustments. So there we go. Prop sync there. Best practices here again for multi-engine operations, the run-up. You definitely, in these larger engines, you don't even think about taking off until you have your temperatures and your pressures correct. In some cases, these bigger engines, it takes a while to get them up to the correct operating temperatures. So it's one of those things that's just kind of part of the game, where you can plan on spending more money on fuel as you're sitting there waiting for those engines to get up to the proper operating temperatures. But you definitely want to make sure that you have the right temperatures set there for these engines. Again, you'll notice that they're using a lot of Piper examples in these, in this book here also. None of this is any different. Prop full forward like you would, and in fact, if you have a turbocharged engine, you're going to want that where if you have a turbocharged system, you're not going to have your mixture set over here in kind of a lean position that you would in a normally aspirated engine. You're going to have that full forward taking off, because again, what you want is you want that sea level type performance on your takeoff. So that's kind of why you'll have on a turbocharged aircraft engine, you'll have those the mixture levers. Good Lord, you'll have the mixture levers pushed forward there to give you that sea level performance. Landing, not that much done here. Propeller overspeed, if you have a runaway prop on this thing, that can kind of be an issue here. The POH will tell you what to do on an overspeed situation that you have. In some cases, you may have lost that speeder spring, may have come unglued with that, and so you kind of have to understand that if that happens, you've got a propeller that's going to be operating like a fixed pitch prop. You're going to have an asymmetrical load on this that you can't adjust anymore. And so what you're going to do is figure out where your balance is going to be, especially on landing, between that prop that may have had a runaway prop where you may have to, in some cases, shut that engine down, and now you have a single engine landing situation that you have. Which in a lot of cases, as long as you can get that thing feathered, you're going to be okay. But if you can't get it feathered, then that's going to be, a kind of a tricky situation that you practice. So there's the prop stuff. So that's chapter 3, the propeller systems. Now we're going to get into more white pages. Fuel. All of these things here are going to be just like the single engine, the fuel types, the 100 low lead, all of these. This 4.1, this is going to be, again, the blue and the black. Those are the things that you have to concern yourselves with now. Back in the day when I first started flying, we had different colors here of different types of aviation gasoline. The 80 and the 100, they have gone the way of the dodo bird a long time ago. So those are not even an option anymore, but it's good to know that they used to exist, to kind of know where we've gone here from a fuel standpoint. They talk about this, without fuel, your airplane's a glider. And, there we go. No understanding, the fuel tanks, understanding the fuel differences, detonation, pre-ignition, all of those things still apply to this. The big thing has to do with the number of tanks, how you access the tanks, the types of tanks that they have in the wings, and how you get that fuel to the engine. One of the things has to do is that with certain fuel pumps, etc., how you get the fuel from the left tank. Typically what you want when things are normally working properly is that you have the fuel that's on the left side and the left wings are going to supply fuel to the left engine. Fuel on the right side are normally going to supply fuel to the right engine. However, in the event of an engine out, or in the event of another kind of a failure, is that you also have the ability in these aircraft to do what we call cross feed, meaning that you can pull fuel from the right wing to service the left engine, and vice versa. You can pull fuel from the left wing to service the right engine if you're in an emergency. Or something has gone wrong. It may not even necessarily be an emergency, but something has gone amiss and you need to pull fuel from that other side. One of the things has to do with that if you have an engine quit for whatever reason, well, now you're no longer pulling fuel from that left wing to supply this engine. So it won't take long, especially in these great big thirsty engines that you have hanging out there out front of these multi-engine aircraft, it won't take long to have a fuel imbalance. And so you want to be able to manage then here along the horizontal axis, you want to be able to manage that fuel, the fuel weight that you have in each wing. So then you're going to want to, at some point, if you're just operating on your right engine, pull fuel from the left so that you're not attempting to land that airplane with no fuel in the right wing and all the fuel in the left. That could be entertaining. So this is kind of what talks about here. Each of these fuel transfer things, they operate, the pumps are different. In some cases, it takes a while for that fuel to actually get moved in these. Down between the seats, normally in the pipers, is where you're going to see these fuel cross feeds, these switches, so that it will allow you to then pull from, in the normal position, they would be in the on position both forward. But if you're having to pull from one of the others, you can pull it here. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful about when you're looking here at figure 4.3 is this. You have an off position somewhere there in the middle. And so normally what you're after is you want these red switches to be at the top or the bottom, but never in the middle, because that'll kind of shut your fuel off. And in case of an emergency where you do need to shut the fuel off, you want to make sure that they're in the center and that they are in the off position, as opposed to maybe being down in the crossfeed. So this is just one of those little, I don't want to say it's tricky, but it's just one of those things that you need to know about how that fuel works. Timing wise, to pull that, each engine manufacturer has different timing on what that looks like and how those pumps can move that fuel around. So that's going to be the thing that you have. You have engine driven fuel pumps and electrically powered fuel pumps, just like you do on single engines. The differences are going to be is that when you run which one. Normally in a gravity feed system, you know, the engine-driven fuel pumps will suffice until you get to a particular altitude where it may require some form of a boost pump that you need, or in the event of a failure of the engine-driven pump, you have the electrical-driven pumps that can supply fuel to your engines. The schematics, these are going to be things that you're going to see in aircraft operating handbooks here, airplane flight manuals, as well as POHs, as to kind of where everything is and how it works. Just remember that when you're going through all of these schematics, it's important for you to understand how all of this works. The more you understand about the systems on your airplane, the safer you're going to be. And that's kind of it. Plus, you also need to understand is that your examiners, when they give you all of these examinations, they want to know that you're safe. And when they ask you these questions about your systems, whether it's fuel, electrical, hydraulic, it doesn't matter. The reason that they want to know that you know how they work is because they understand how crucial that information is with regard to the safe operation of that airplane. And that's kind of a you know, it's kind of a big deal. Stand by here, I was just moving something here. Here's another type of a schematic that they have. This almost looks like a Piper right here. No, that's a Cessna, sorry, Cessna. So this kind of tells you where you are. It shows you your fuel tanks. It shows you where you may have your locker fuel. What is locker fuel? You may have behind the engine of each aircraft, you may have another small fuel tank that may hold more fuel than what you can hold in the wings over here. So in the wing tanks, they're showing that you have 103 gallons. In the locker tanks, they're showing 28 gallons each. So if you look at this, here's 206, here's 56, so that is 262, something like that maybe. Total gallons of fuel that you may be responsible for, multiply that times 6, and there's the weight that you have in this aircraft with fuel. The locker tanks, those are you'll have a special switch to move that fuel from this locker into your wing tank that goes into your engine. The locker tanks normally, at least not that I'm aware of, normally the locker tanks will not feed the engine itself. That fuel then gets pumped into the tanks and then from the tanks to the engines, because that's the way that they have them set up. So the thing that you need to realize is that before you turn the switch on for these locker tanks, you got to make sure that you have room in your mains for that fuel. If for whatever reason, let's say that you have these tanks and they're full and you just take off, and for whatever reason you or someone in the airplane hits the switch to do this, this transfer from the locker tanks into your mains. Well, what's going to happen? Well, number one, you're going to have more fuel go into those tanks than it can hold. And when that happens, all of that fuel then, through those pressure valves, it gets pumped outside of your engine. So you're going to start blowing fuel back behind your airplane. Now, is that going to be dangerous? Well, it may or may not catch fire, but number one, you're spraying fuel, behind your airplane, and two, you're not going to have the fuel that you think you may need to complete your flight if you're counting on that fuel from those locker tanks to help you to complete that flight there as well. So not only are you just wasting fuel, but you're also, environmentally that's not good, as well as, heaven forbid that you have some kind of a fire because that's being sprayed out there. So you need to know what that is. Before you transfer fuel into another tank, you need to make sure that regardless of how you're doing it, whether it's a cross-feed situation or whether it's pulling fuel from a locker tank, is that you have room to put it. So you want to make sure that you have enough air in that tank to allow for the incoming fuel. There's that. Even in my my Cessna, my 206, I have tip tanks out at the end of my wings. Well, it's the same thing there. I have these two pumps for each one of those flip tanks over here in front of the co-pilot. And then when I flip those, that transfer pump comes on to pump that fuel from the tip tanks into the main tanks. But if I don't have, if I haven't used enough fuel, that fuel that goes from the tip tanks to the mains just gets sprayed out behind the back of my airplane. So again, you got to make sure that you have room for that fuel before you transfer it. Showing here the fuel selector valves, showing you how all the throttle and the mixture controls work, all of this. I'm I'm a little geeky about this stuff, and so I kind of enjoy looking at these kinds of things. And I know that to some people, they'll look at a schematic like this, like this. But over time, you kind of develop an appreciation for these things. And the big thing that allows you to develop that appreciation, just like it does with most things, is like when something goes wrong. Everything is great. What can possibly go wrong? Then all of a sudden, you're out there flying and you notice that you have one gauge, tick, 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 over here that you're going, why is it over here that I'm showing I have no fuel? What? And now all of a sudden, you've got a situation. So then it really kind of forces you almost to get back into those books and to say, okay, what the heck? So again, having those things happen to you will help you develop an appreciation for this. My advice to young folk like yourself is to go ahead and just try to listen to me and develop that appreciation now. So, fuel considerations here, calculating, managing fuel burn, just like a single. You can look at those here as well, understanding what altitude is doing for you here, why you would use a boost pump, when it would call for the boost pump. Again, the manufacturer is going to tell you what their recommendations are for how to use it. And whether that be you've lost a main fuel pump or an engine-driven fuel pump, or you're at an altitude now where you need a little more pressure in that line to eliminate those bubbles in there. Emergencies, again, when you look at this, one of the things that you're going to find is that when you look at the emergency section of a single engine aircraft, it's kind of thin. When you look at the emergency section of a multi-engine aircraft, it's different. It's a much bigger chapter. So, and that's why, is because you have so many different systems that you're responsible for when you're looking at these emergencies. So, can you have a pump failure? Yep. That's it. Fuel filter blockage in some of the older aircraft, that's a little bit more of a chance of that happening, especially when you're dealing with older tanks, especially if they're like wet wing tanks in a metal airplane, where over time you start getting this debris that goes into those tanks, through the lines, into the filters. If your filters haven't been changed or cleaned properly or at the prescribed intervals, they can collect gunk in those filters, and when that happens in those filters, then it can clog any kind of fuel movement through the filter into the line that goes into your engine. So again, those fuel filters, they have to be cleaned or replaced at particular intervals that they have. You'll notice also, and one thing too, if you're flying an older twin and you're sumping the tanks and you start to notice a little particulate matter in there, again, understanding that you're gonna keep sumping that fuel out of there until you get a clean catch on these things. But if you start seeing that particulate in there, ding, 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 you start thinking in terms of your fuel filter as well, and thinking, okay, it's time to examine that fuel filter a little more often perhaps than I have been. Fuel freezing, there can be situations where certain lines are exposed to a colder operating temperature than others. In that case, fuel can freeze. In some cases with this, they will put a fuel additive in some of the fuels, especially jet fuel, and it's called PRIST. And what that does is that it's a preventative. It prevents that ice from building in those lines so that the fuel can flow. There was a pretty tragic accident that kind of happened it was a Pilatus PC-12, if I recall correctly, a Pilatus PC-12 that actually had fuel lines freeze up, and the airplane crashed into a cemetery. And I want to say it was in Montana, perhaps, or Wyoming, someplace like that. It was kind of this bad deal. But they ultimately found that they had a fuel line freezing issue that they had with that. And I can't remember the details if the pilot elected to get fuel without the PRIST or with it. So just know that that's out there. But normally that applies to more jet fuel than anything else. Can you have a fuel leak? Oh my God, yes. And especially when you think about the complexity of the plumbing involved in all of the fuel with multi-engine aircraft. Every time you have a joint, every time something is joined together, you have an opportunity for a leak. And even in some cases there, just beyond the leaking part of it, you're going to have pressures that over time can cause leaking through a gasket or something like that. So this is again where I'm going with the systems on the multis, is the fact that you've got larger airplanes, you have longer connections, you have more connections, and every time that you have one of those connections, there's another opportunity for some kind of a leak. Single engine fuel management, this goes back to the crossfeed piece that we talked about. Definitely you're going to want to read this to kind of see how that goes through the single engine crossfeed, and that is chapter 4. Do you like the pace of the class so far? Yeah, there you go. Landing gear, this is going to be a little bit different, and we're going to dive into chapter 5 on this next lesson. This is where we'll pick this up. So again, Ellie, just keep reading this stuff, keep going through it. A good healthy skimming habits on this will you'll be able to see real quick where you're reading stuff that you know already. Oh, listen, timer. And then other things that may be new to you. Review the stuff the things that you have seen before, and then really pay more attention to the stuff that's new. Okay, so there you go, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks, and I will talk with you soon.